Having understood the meaning of ideology and its role in shaping social movements as well as shaping the social structure and order, let us now discuss what are the broad ideological trends that has guided and influenced Indian environmental movements and environmentalism in India. Before that, let us begin with the definition of Ramchandra Guha of environmental movements. Guha defines environmental movements as organized social activities which aimed at promoting sustainable use of natural resources, halting degradation of natural resources and bringing about environmental restorations. In other words, Indian environmental movements are not only about protesting, not only about confronting or direct action against environmental degradation. These environmental ideas or environmentalism is also about environmental restoration, is also about reshaping the nature and building a symbiotic relationship between human society and that of the nature. So, in that sense, there are several broad ideas and several broad ideologies which have governed Indian environmental movements and have tried to create a more symbiotic relationship, a more synergetic relationship between human society and that of nature. Ramchandra Guha, in his book Ecology and Equity, has identified 7 broad ideological trends or 7 broad ideological perspectives that have guided Indian environmental movements and environmentalism in India. 2 of these broad ideas, the 2 of these broad ideologies concerned conserving the nature. While one talks about conserving the nature based on scientific principles, based on recreational activities, based on aesthetics, the other talks about conservation of nature based on culture, religion and tradition. The ideological trends which support nature conservation based on scientific principles or based on wilderness or based on recreational values are mostly adhered by the urban middle class. It is this section of the society which wants to preserve nature for the sake of scientific research, for the sake of scientific development of recreational activities. While on the other hand, we also find a different kind of ideological trend where nature conservation is argued or where nature conservation is advocated based on traditional customs, based on traditional practices, religions and culture. So, here Ramchandra Guha cites examples from the Rajasthan where the Bishnoi community tries to protect several animals and wilderness. So, Bishnoi communities' love for nature or the tribal communities' love for wild animals is derived from their traditional practices, derived from their culture, from their religion. So, therefore, one of the dominant ideological trend in Indian environmentalism has been that of conservation of nature. Conservation of nature argued from a scientific principle, argued from recreational values as well as conservation of nature argued based on religion, customs and tradition. So, the third ideological trend talks about efficient use of the resource. So, here the focus is on resource management, natural resource management, and this ideological trend talks about conserving the resources in a sustainable manner. So, sustainable development or sustainability becomes an important idea or becomes an important ideological orientation under this broad framework. So, here resources, here the main focus in managing the resource in a more efficient way, taking into consideration the resource base as well as the developmental needs of the community. So, this ideological trend, efficient use of the resource, tries to make a balance between economic growth and sustainable development or natural resource management. However, Ramchandra Guha is of the opinion that the dominant ideological trend is concerning equity and access to resources. While nature conservation, management of resources are important ideological orientations in Indian environmentalism, the dominant ideological trend which has governed Indian environmental movements relates to issues of resource capture, relates to issues of resource use and equity. In that sense, Guha is of the opinion that most of the Indian environmental movements are in fact a conflict between the omnivores and the ecosystem people. So, we need to understand these two categories. He is of the opinion that most of the movements are a confrontation, a conflict between omnivores and ecosystem people. So, who are these omnivores and who are these ecosystem people? According to Ramchandra Guha, omnivores are those who have gained disproportionately from economic growth. So, in other words, omnivores are urban middle class who have sufficiently gained, who have sufficiently reaped the benefit out of economic growth, and the ecosystem people are those whose livelihood have been seriously degraded along with environmental degradation because of the capitalist development process or the dominant development process. In other words, it is the omnivores who are the urban middle class, the beneficiaries of development, and the ecosystem people, or in other words, the sufferers, those who have suffered because of economic development, or those who have suffered along with environmental degradation. These are the two important players, two important actors in Indian environmental movements or Indian environmental ideology, because it is the omnivores, or this distinction between omnivores and ecosystem people makes one thing clear, that environmental degradation simultaneously results in livelihood degradation. It results in livelihood insecurity, and therefore, it is the ecosystem people who are the sufferers of environmental degradation. And environmental movements for most part includes a conflict or contradiction between the omnivores and ecosystem people. Considering issues of equity, resource capture and claim over resources, Ramchandra Guha identifies three broad or three important ideological trends. Besides those of nature conservation and efficient resource use, Ramchandra Guha says that there are three important ideological strands or ideological perspectives in Indian environmental movement. These are what he terms as Crusading Gandhians, Ecological Marxists and appropriate technocrats. In other words, the 7 broad ideological trends identified by Ramchandra Guha are the following. 1. Conservation of nature on the ground of aesthetics, recreational and scientific principles, mostly from the urban middle class. 2nd. Conservation of nature on the grounds of culture, religion and tradition. 3rd. Efficiency of resource use from a techno-economic perspective. 4th. The Crusading Gandhians or the Gandhian environmentalists who take a moral stand to check overuse and to do justice to the poor. 5th. The Ecological Marxists who aim at dismantling the unjust social order. 6th. The appropriate technocrats who want to reconstruct the nature by using appropriate technologies or scientific knowledge. And 7. The revival of community based management systems, where communities or where local people play an important role in taking care or in managing local natural resources. In other words, these are the 7 broad ideological trends of Indian environmentalism. However, as Ramchandra Guha pointed out of those 7 broad strands or 7 broad ideological orientations, there are 3 which are more prominent, and these 3 are Crusading Gandhians, Ecological Marxists and appropriate technocrats. So, therefore, it is the Gandhian ideology, Marxist ideology and appropriate technocratic ideology, they have guided, they have inspired Indian environmental movements to a great extent. So, let us learn what are these 3 ideological orientations in the Indian environmentalism and how they are different from each other. Environmental Gandhians, or as Ramchandra Guha terms them, Crusading Gandhians, they reject modern life, or Crusading Gandhians reject modern life or modern industrialism from a moral and ethical grounds. For environmental Gandhians or for Crusading Gandhians, environmental degradation is a moral problem, and its origin lies in acceptance of materialism, its origin lies in accepting the industrial way of life and consumerism. So, therefore, environmental Gandhians talk about, or they reject the wasteful lifestyle. According to Mahatma Gandhi or according to the Gandhian philosophy, the earth has enough for everybody's need, but is not the resources are not sufficient for any one person's need. So, therefore, Gandhian environmental ideas basically calls about or basically aspires for a pre-colonial or pre-capitalist rural way of life. Gandhian ideas of Gram Swaraj, Gandhian ideas of village republic talk about social and ecological harmony. In other words, Gandhian ideas or Crusading Gandhians talk about an alternative philosophy to modernity. They talk about an alternative development path or alternative development paradigm. One of the important characteristics of Gandhian environmentalist or Crusading Gandhian ideology in Indian environmentalism is its rejection of modernity, rejection of modern science, modern technology, industrial way of life from a moral and ethical grounds. And we may cite the examples of important environmentalists like Sundarlal Bahuguna, like Baba Amte, like Medha Patkar, who have successfully followed and adopted Gandhian ideas, not only in their thinking, not only in their ideas, but also in their action in different environmental movements in India. As we have discussed, that ideology helps both in defining the movement and deciding its course of action. Similarly or likewise, Gandhian environmental ideas or Gandhian ideology has significantly influenced Indian environmental movements both in defining the movement, characterizing the movement, as well as deciding its course of action or strategies of protest. These Gandhian environmentalists have successfully used Gandhian protest methods like Padayatra, like hunger strike, like putting moral pressure on the state, like non-violent means as their strategy, as their forms of action in different environmental movements. The second important ideological strand is that of Marxism, or as Ramchandra Gua points them as ecological Marxist. Ecological Marxism or ecological Marxists see environmental problem or they perceive environmental problem from a political economic perspective. According to ecological Marxism, environmental problem lies in According to ecological Marxism, environmental degradation or environmental problem lies in the production process. So, therefore, it is the mode of production or relations of production which is crucial to understand environmental problems or environmental movements in India, because most of these movements arise out of an issue of resource capture, arise out of an issue of unequal access to resources, and therefore, the central problem or the core of environmental movements lies in not in ideas, but in material realities. It is the unequal access to resources, unequal access to benefits of resources or resource use that is central to understand Indian environmental movements from a Marxian perspective. And Marxian ideas or environmental Marxism tries to understand environmental movements from the mode of production debate or from the relations of production debate. It is the opinion that while the poor depend upon resources or sometimes degrade the natural resources for their survival, rich degrade the resources for profit. So, therefore, environmental movements are essentially a conflict between two versions of economy, the political economy of profit and the moral economy of need and survival. So, therefore, environmental movements are basically a struggle between survival and profit. It is a struggle between survival of local communities and profit by the capitalist, by the industrialist or the industrialist state. So, in other words, environmental movements are a kind of class struggle, environmental movements are a kind of struggle between two classes of people who have different stake in resources, who have different claim over resources or who have differential access to resources. So, therefore, it is differences in access to resources and differences in access to reaping the benefits of natural resources that is the central in understanding environmental movements and environmental ideas from a Marxian perspective. So, what are the goals or what are the ultimate aspirations of ecological Marxism? Ramchandra Gua says that ecological Marxism calls for a just and egalitarian social order, because since the problem lies in social and political inequality, since the problem lies in social, political and economic inequality, perhaps the solution to environmental problems lies in an egalitarian social order. So, in that sense, ecological Marxists call for the creation of an economically just society, which is a precondition for socio-ecological harmony. They call for work for, so therefore, ecological Marxists work for larger goal of redistribution of economic and political power. So, therefore, what is central, what is the ultimate goal of ecological Marxism is dismantling of the unequal social order and redistribution of political, economic and social power. So, therefore, the central problem is unequal access to resources, and perhaps environmental problems can be solved by ensuring equal access to resources, equal benefits from resources. And examples of ecological Marxists in the Indian context is perhaps the people science movement in Kerala, where effort is to popularize the idea that it is the modern science and technology which is the destroyer, which is the degrader of natural resources, as well as which creates insecurities for the livelihood of the poor. So, therefore, the poor should unite, the poor should mobilize collectively, not only to dismantle the social order, not only to dismantle the dominant social order, but also to ensure a more balanced relationship with nature, a more synergetic relationship with nature. So, Crusading Gandhians and ecological Marxists represent the two important ideological trends in Indian environmental movement. There are so many differences, there are quite many differences between these two broad ideological trends in Indian environmental movements. With regard to their approach towards tradition, for Gandhians, it is the culture, tradition, religion which is the source of inspiration, whereas for ecological Marxists, they outrightly reject the tradition and culture, and they adhere or they worship modern science and technology. So, while Gandhians reject science, reject industrialism, ecological Marxists are perhaps front runners in accepting industrial way of life, front runners in accepting industrialism as a way of life. Secondly, these two ideological trends are also different with regard to their forms of action. While Gandhian environmental ideology relies more on non-violent forms of protest, Marxian environmental ideology or ecological Marxists rely more on direct action confronts or direct action or direct confrontations. So, therefore, Marxian environmental movements relies more on direct action, whereas Gandhian ideologies or Gandhian environmental movements rely more on non-violent ways of protesting. The third important ideological trend in Indian environmentalism is that of appropriate technocrats. Ramchandra Guha says that while Crusading Gandhians are the ideological extreme and ecological Marxists are the political extreme of Indian environmental ideas or environmentalism, it is the appropriate technocrats who carve a middle ground. Appropriate technocrats try to make a balance between tradition and modernity, and they are equally influenced by Gandhian ideas as well as Western socialism. Appropriate technocrat or appropriate technocratic ideology calls for a synthesis or a balance between agriculture and industry, big and small units, and Western technology and Eastern tradition. They are influenced both by rural romanticism of Mahatma Gandhi as well as reliance on technology or technological knowledge by Western socialism. So, therefore, they are critical about hierarchy and at the same time focus on reconstructing or focus on bringing an egalitarian social order. So, therefore, the focus is on resource conservation, labor intensive technology and socially liberating technology, while appropriate technocrats do not outrightly reject modern industry, but they emphasize more on labor intensive technology, they emphasize more on labor intensive industrialization. While Ramchandra Guha identifies these three, Crusading Gandhians, ecological Marxists and appropriate technocrats as dominant ideologies of Indian environmental movement, but he is also of the opinion that these three are not distinct, or these three ideological trends may also be visible in a particular movement. And he takes the example of Chipko and tries to point out or tries to highlight that Chipko movement successfully includes within it all these three ideological trends, or in other words, Marxian Crusading Gandhians, ecological Marxists and appropriate technocrats are well represented in the Chipko movement. The Gandhians in the Chipko movement are associated with the works of Sundarlal Bahuguna. The Marxist trend in the Chipko movement is associated with the Uttarakhand Sangharsh Bahini, which in fact a struggle against the commercial forestry, which struggle against the mining and illegal liquor trade, and the appropriate technology trend in the Chipko movement is represented by the Dasauli Gram Swaraj model, which in fact organized the movement and which also worked on reforestation, bringing ecological balance, water conservation technologies, and therefore what Ramchandra Guha tries to say, that even though they are different ideologies or ideological orientations, but it is quite possible that we may observe these ideologies in one particular movement. So, in other words, a movement can include Gandhian ideologies, Marxist ideologies, as well as technocratic ideologies. But these three ideologies are different from each other, and they are different not only in their ideas and manifestations, but also in their way of deciding or influencing the strategy of the movement, the action of the movement. So, to summarize this part of the lecture, we may say that there are three important ideological trends in Indian environmental movement. Despite Ramchandra Guha identify 7 broad ranges of ideological trends, but there are 3 which are most important: the Crusading Gandhians, the Ecological Marxists, and the appropriate technocrats. While the Crusading Gandhians reject industrialism and Western science from a moral and ethical point of view and calls for accepting the pre-capitalist rural way of life or rural development, it is the Ecological Marxists who highlight the unequal access to resources and unequal sharing of benefits. So, therefore, Ramchandra Guha says that while Gandhians are the ideological extremes, Marxists are the political extremes, and in between these two ideological trends, the third ideological trend is that of appropriate technocrats, which emphasizes more on appropriate use of technology for delivering benefits to the people. So, appropriate technocrats mostly talk about resource conservation at a micro level, like reforestation, environmental conservation activities, water conservation. These are activities taken by the appropriate technocrats. The appropriate technocrat ideology basically tries to bring a synthesis between agriculture and industry. It tries to bring a synthesis between Western science and Indian culture. So, therefore, the 3 broad ideologies or ideological trend in Indian environmentalism is that of Crusading Gandhians, Ecological Marxists, and the appropriate technocrats.